Hello, everyone. We have another round of MVP talks for Fluently Salesforce invention that we're doing in YouTube. Today, the subject is on email marketing and how individuals have multiple email addresses. And we have from marketing, cloud or Pardot or whichever perspective, how would we handle this? So this came from an initial question in Slack that triggered this session idea. And the question went like this: how to manage a contact with a personal email address and a work address and then university address when we want to manage form submissions? So new inquiries from the submissions of existing, in that case, students, and how to use different email addresses depending the kind of content that you want to send, how to manage this. So this is basically what triggered this conversation. I'm Ines Garcia, I'm a Salesforce MVP, I'm an agile coach, I'm an inventor, and I come from communication background. So I have a little bit of experience with Marketing Cloud, Pardot, and other email applications. Jodie?
Hi, I'm Jodie Miners. I'm MVP from Melbourne, Australia. We're currently in our first day of lockdown and for the fourth time. And it's middle of winter and the evening. So over to you, Daniel.
Daniel Stange, Salesforce MVP from the Frankfurt area in Germany. I'm a technical architect and working as a CTO for DRD Interaktiven, an implementation partner in Germany. Over to, let's say, Szandor is the next one on the right-hand side.
Hello, I'm Szandor. I'm a Munich-based MVP in Germany, collaborating with you on the Fluently Salesforce talks for a few times now. And today I'm really looking forward to learn a lot because I don't think this is my special area of expertise. Over to Kerry.
Hi, Kerry Townsend, based in the UK, also an MVP. I've been working with Salesforce and Marketing Cloud over the last decade. So this is a space that I have been in, but I'm looking forward to the discussion. And over to Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Zullo. I am a North Carolina-based MVP and marketing champion here in the US. I've been working with the Marketing Cloud and other marketing technology for quite a while.
And Oleh to finish us off.
Yeah, hi all. Nice to be here with all of you. I'm a Ukrainian Salesforce developer group leader and MVP. So my area is more about sales, service cloud, and integrations, but also curious about the marketing cloud. And yeah, it would be nice to get some questions on this.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so over to Miro. And just to give a little bit of context, so what is our problems? Our problem is that we have an individual and we all have multiple email addresses. I imagine that's something that is not uncommon, right? And what's happened is that doesn't matter which email application you will be using, Pardot, Marketing Cloud, MailChimp, ActiveCampaign, whatever, will handle that one email goes to one person, right? They don't have the ability out of the box to know that this one individual has multiple email addresses. So this is the state of play. I broke down some ideas that I think also are interesting to cover in terms of how that rolls. Is that the first time you try to send an email from any application, what's going to do is exclude generic email addresses. And this sometimes comes as a surprise. The very first thing they check is that the email per se is an individual. It's not an accounts at whichever domain or admin or info and stuff like that.
So this is Marketing Cloud or Campaign Monitor or MailChimp. They all do this sort of stuff. It's just they don't want to spam people, so no generic addresses.
And feel free to chip in with that whenever you want. So how that goes, how does that email goes to the individual is through an ID. And the ID doesn't really matter what it is. Depends on the application that you use. Sometimes the email is set up to be that unique ID for that individual, but sometimes you have the ability to decide if that specific subscriber ID or email ID is something else, a number, in our case, sometimes Salesforce contact ID and things like that. And that's what is used basically to sync from the email application into your database of individuals, right? So that helps to know who's getting that email. Okay, so out of these two options, sometimes it's a bit of a confusion. So I thought, I'll bring a little explanation of what is the logic that the email application actually goes through. So in the scenario that the email address is the unique identifier for the individual, the application does this. Let me zoom in a little bit. Right. So at the top, what we have is a specific example from Marketing Cloud that it says, the email address is the subscriber key in all subscribers list. That is the all people sort of list. And then the email application goes and checks if that email address exists in that all subscriber list. If it does, checks the status of the subscriber. If it's unsubscribed, doesn't send the email. If it's active, okay, and sends the email. If the email doesn't exist in that all list, then it adds one new row and sets the subscriber as active, because the email application assumes that you have done your due diligence and you have the permission to send an email to that individual. Okay, this is when you use an email as that unique identifier. Now, how is that logic applied when you use something else, that contact ID or whatever it is for the unique identifier? Let's go have a look. It might sound familiar. So let's say here we have the customer number. That's what we're going to be using to match in the all subscribers. So what it does, the application goes and checks that customer number value in the all subscribers. If it finds it, then it checks, is it an active subscriber? If it's not, if it's unsubscribed, doesn't send the email. If it's active, then goes and sends the email. How if
What's the same?
How if the customer number doesn't exist? Then it creates a new row and adds the customer number and also the email address and the status as active and sends the email. So very similar, right?
And I haven't seen that Campaign Monitor or MailChimp does this sort of thing. It doesn't. It can only handle the email addresses as the key. So it's when you're getting up into something like Marketing Cloud that you can do something like this. But it looks the same. What's the difference?
But in Marketing Cloud, it's key that or to access some of the functionality in Marketing Cloud, you need to use contact ID, not just a customer number. Because if you don't use contact ID, then the native capability that's built in there means that it can't share the history and the engagement history with Service Cloud.
Right.
So you can set up Service Cloud so it can show, whether they bounced, clicked, or opened, or what activity they might have seen. But if you choose not to use specifically contact ID, then you lose the ability to get that information back into Salesforce.
Whereas Campaign Monitor's integration by Beaufort 12 it creates a record in Salesforce and then matches it to that record as a lookup to the contact ID. It's still a one-to-one match from the email address to the contact ID, but it's just through another thing called the subscriber record.
Okay, so I think we're good in context. Is there any other bits we should be covering a little bit in terms of how the applications maps to individuals and emails that we haven't yet?
No, I think that's pretty covers it.
Okay, well, so now how do we fix it if it's something to fix? So again, a recap of what is our situation. So our situation is that as an organization, your company may hold different email addresses for the same person. It depending on what that person does, you will be sending different comms. How do you handle that?
So the first question is why? Why do we want to even bother with people having multiple email addresses? Yes, people do have multiple email addresses, but for me as a business, why do I want to even know that? They just tell me one email address. If they want to update their email address, they update their email address. They're my contact, but I just want to email them. I don't care which email address I send them to. Why would I bother?
Well, for better or worse, it's very probable that the individual on the other end, on the receiving end, expects you to know that they are the same person.
Mm-hmm.
Right or wrong, they don't care what you think. If they're giving you information about them and have a few different email addresses, like most people do, then they expect some level of, oh, you're the same person. I've talked to you about this, regardless of the email that they have used in the past, which makes it more challenging for us.
Yeah. So how do we verify?
I would challenge that.
Yeah.
I would challenge that, because if I've, like in a situation where I've got a work, for example, I could work with an organization with a work email, but I could also work with an organization with a private email. So I might purchase something from them on behalf of my company because I've been given that option, or I might purchase something from them privately, and I don't want them to change that or merge them or talk to me about different things on those channels, because I've expressly talked to them in that way. So, for example, if I was engaging with a training organization, and I've done this in the past where I've taken training courses, but my work company has paid for it, then I want all the communications and everything to do with that to come through my work invoice, my work email. So I get an invoice. So I've got an audit trail, because if I wasn't doing that piece of, like, if it wasn't working for that organization and they weren't funding it, then I wouldn't be doing it. But if I engaged with them separately on a different course for a different reason through my personal email, then I would want them to honor the communication that I have asked for in that format. And I don't really want them to cross market to me, because crossing the stream there, or considering that my lifetime value is dependent on both of those together, is inaccurate, because I only really have authority to make decisions for myself, and then everything else is a function of who I work for, which changes over time.
One addition here, Kerry. But if you, for example, have a case that some organization provides some discounts, for example, and you've been a customer from your company and you did some like 2 trainings, right? And they provided you like some discount, and now you're ordering something like personally, and you like can use this discount, right? As you got for previous ones. So in some cases you would like to merge them, but in some maybe you don't want. And it's here like a choice if it's needed or not.
But I wouldn't necessarily want them to communicate with me in a different manner. And I can understand your point, and there would be value, but in some places there are tax implications from that. So I can't just say that I get a benefit in kind from work that I did with companies, because if I was in procurement in a government organization and we put a load of business through an organization, and then I got what effectively could be kickbacks somewhere else, that also feels like it, you know, there's an area which, again, that's personal responsibility. And that isn't to say that you couldn't, benefit from that in some ways. But if I think about a work context and how organizations deal with me, so I work in a consulting setting and I work for different organizations. And in some cases, I sign agreements to say that I won't share the information that who I work with or what I do with a certain organization, like with anybody else. I'm not meant to talk about it. But if an organization that I interact with are actually consolidating my records in the background without me understanding or having a choice about how they consolidate those records, then that can put me in a difficult situation, because if you then talk to me in my personal email about things that I have come up in my work setting, then that in itself is a challenge for me, and it causes a problem.
Can I just hop in for a second and ask two things? So first of all, can we agree on a few base definitions, like how is the relation of identity to email address in our example? Because what I'm feeling is we're discussing how people use email addresses, and I believe that's something we cannot discuss because we can't decide for them how they use their email addresses. What we can use for today is to assume one identity, many email addresses, or one email address per identity. I personally side with you, Kerry. I say it makes my life a lot easier to have different email addresses and have different identities back there that come back to me. But if I compare to friends I know, they have a spam email address, they have a high official email address, and they have a friend's email address. And the expectation there is, I believe, something different, namely that I'm always the same individual doing all transactions, and that's more B2C, I say, so business to consumer maybe, whereas in business to business, I would be lost without, if everything was just merged to me personally. I want to have distinct steps. I want to get rid of an identity if I skip my workplace. But I'm not sure if everyone wants to get rid of their identity with their personal email addresses. I think the expectation there is I remain the same person, no matter if I change email addresses or add a new alias or whatever. And I think we need to agree on which scenario are we discussing today.
It's a good one because it's different for every single company. For me, I don't know. And as a client, as a consultant working with clients, I don't know that I've ever come across this, that I've had to actually work it out.
Let's imagine higher education, for example, or when you, uni, right? So you would have your own email address where you probably sign up to some things. The university, or at least mine, they used to, I think it's quite common, they provide a university email address for that student. So certain comms will go to that. Now, for the university to be smart enough, would be able to decide, depending on the content, what's gonna go to the official university email address versus the other one that they also host, which is the personal student email address.
So I think in most organizations, there's going to be a bit of mix of both, isn't it? Because we can't control whether someone submits two different custom forms with two different email addresses as they want two different identities, or they submit two different custom forms with two different email addresses and they want the same identity. We don't, how do we even know that?
We don't, I'd say we don't. Hence, we need to make a hard decision on how to relate an individual to email. And as long as we can't make a decision on that one, it's really hard for me to engage in solution thinking, because that's a fundamental I need to be clear about.
So unless we have another identifier that that we know that those two different identities with the two different email addresses, the identities in this case being contact records in Salesforce, let's think of that way. They've got two different contact records in Salesforce because two different custom forms have been created. They've got two different emails. Unless we have another way of identifying that person via some other unique identity, Chris?
So I generally agree with the ideas. Like Kerry, I agree with your challenge. I break things up because I want to control the conversation that I'm having with whoever. So from a personal perspective, I align to that. I think, Szandor, to your point, I think if we're talking about what are we trying to solve for, obviously we can't solve for the individual. I would propose we look at it, like, I think I'm basically piggybacking off what you're saying, is we look at it from the organization who's sending the emails perspective. They want to make sense of this regardless of what that person wishes. And they have in their mind a valid use case. If you think about it from a B2C or even a higher ed point of view, maybe even B2B, it doesn't really matter. Basically, if there are scenarios where the same individual could be coming through the same sort of funnel, but working with different entities. So if you think of B2C, you have a big conglomerate that has 40 different brands. They have a valid use case, perhaps, to want to at least have a clue as to how much they are sending to an individual. If they are interested in 5 of those brands, there may be situations where they want to sort of dial it back or maybe bring things, slow things down a little bit. Again, I would still rather sort of individually control that from my perspective, but from a business point of view, I either have one person with multiple emails, or I have multiple records with one email. Either way, that can get messy. We do have storage considerations and other considerations involved around the data, and how do we keep the data clean?
I'm trying to find a use case on which we might agree on. So let's take on the university example. Assume the university sends me an email to my official university address. So far, so good. I hit the reply button. I have forwarded that email. So the official email is forwarded to my personal Gmail account. I hit the reply button. The answer will be sent from my personal email account. And the requirement now is that the system should know that. The system should know that's still me, although a completely different email address is used. Is that something we're discussing today? I'm still not sure, because the intro was about sending out emails. And now I'm rather having the case, the Salesforce case image in my head, saying I write some communication and I receive communication back from a different email address claiming to be the same individual.
Yeah, it's probably easier if you envision that you already know this. If you look at the privacy data model in Salesforce, there's an opportunity to say this contact, referring back to having a contact ID, as Kerry said, as the subscriber key. And on that contact, there is the individual, the contact refers to the individual, and each individual can have contact point emails. And this actually allows you to say, this contact is this and that person, and that person has a set of emails. So I might have a Gmail and a Yahoo email, and let's assume that we all know that we already know that that there is an identity behind these two emails that are stored as contact point emails, and we know that one has the character of being the private email and the other one being my primary email, and but also a personal email, and then there might be a business email as well registered. So if we have that information, that would make the scenario a bit easier if we had stored it in Salesforce privacy control objects already. So it's basically the marketing label of Customer 360 behind this, but it's basically the data structures. And if we had this already and had them mapped to the subscriber key as being the contact ID, we could make that decision depending on which kind of, if the user is subscribed to this newsletter, we will address his Yahoo address, and if we send them transaction in the mail, we send it to the address that is flagged as the primary email in the Salesforce data structures. I think that would make it much easier. So to bring it into that direction, that we already have a data structure in Salesforce in the privacy object, for example, privacy objects, for example, that we can then use to go down a decision tree, say in Marketing Cloud, and say for commercial sense versus transactional sense, we go this and that path and address this person. I agree with all we said before. We cannot assume identity behind an email address, several email addresses. That's nothing we should do. We shouldn't guess. We shouldn't hop from one identity to the other. We shouldn't connect identities or assume that there's a connection between identities, because that is not really allowed and might even lead to awkward situations when you leave your employer, your old employer, and someone else gets the address. So we typically, we in our company years back had email addresses like first name @die-Interaktiven, and there used to be a Daniel, and after he left the company, his old email was mapped to Daniel being me. That makes situations even worse. So we should never make guesses about what identity is behind an email address. But there is a data structure in Salesforce that allows us to map multiple email addresses to the person behind a contact. So
that does that actually work out of the box with Marketing Cloud? Because I've never seen it actually working like with
definitely not out of the box.
Yeah,
so you need to build these as data extensions as well, and bring this over. And you need to map this so that you can really make the assumption this contact is this and this individual, and this individual has these email addresses. So that's hard work behind that to get that going and use it in your sense.
Yeah.
Hey, Daniel, one question. Yeah, sorry, Jodie, go ahead if you like.
No, go.
Yeah, I just want to remark. So, but about if you're talking about communication, so if you like put several email addresses on one person, but if we decide like one primary, right? So we will keep only conversations, this thread with like sending out and sending in emails. So in one primary email, right? We will not be able to combine different emails in one thread because system cannot analyze, right? So we need always change like this primary email and do communication only on this one.
So the nonprofit success pack has a thing called primary contact, secondary contact address. And what all that really does is it's 3 email address fields on the record, and you change the drop down to say which is the email you want to do, and all that does is copy that email value into the Salesforce email field. So you can still only ever deal with one email address at a time, but you can still record those other email addresses and change them if you want to. So it's sort of similar to that new object with a privacy object where you've got multiple email addresses, but you should be able to use those multiple email addresses in an easier way with that new privacy object.
Yeah, that's fair.
The NPSP works with Salesforce, but it won't connect to other tools. Yeah. So if you connect that to MailChimp, it will have no acknowledgement of those others.
Yes,
that's right. Yeah. The NPSP data model is a bit easier because it doesn't have that kind of traversal up to the individual and then down to the contact point emails, which is a nuisance actually, because there could be more than one contact record linked to one individual and then holding the email addresses for not just one contact but multiple contacts. And that could be detrimental to the effort that we're trying to do here. So the NPSP data model might even be the easier way to understand this.
But just to highlight with Salesforce and all the stuff that they're doing with B2C, they are saying that the contact ID is the primary key across clouds, rather than say the individual ID.
Right.
So instead of taking the opportunity to key that in with that multiple email address functionality, we're primarily focusing, at least at this time, with contact ID.
So Kerry, would you then have two contact records for the two different identities or personas or whatever you want to do for a different person? You would have two separate contact records.
That is my understanding. And I just want to highlight back to a point that Chris made in terms of organizations having these conversations. And I think the conversation that we're having here is very timely because, again, these are the conversations organizations are having, and they're having these with Salesforce, and Salesforce are therefore working on the data identity product and identity products around Marketing Cloud in order to work on specifically this challenge. And they have a position and a solution, well, a stance on this. And I think, like, I smile when, Chris and I have this conversation, because we've been part of some conversations where we've been learning about, what is that proposed B2C architecture? What are the tools and what are the recommendations? And as it stands today, the official recommendation is that you keep all of those individual profiles, but you look to unify across an individual ID, which in the Salesforce landscape with the products that are available is the global party ID, which is defined by Customer 360 Data Manager, which when you then use the suite of products across B2C, so B2C Commerce, Marketing Cloud, and Service Cloud, there is then an acknowledgement of what this global party ID will be, so that you can see those consolidated profiles under that one human identity, and it has that number. But whether the products are all keyed in to be able to seamlessly work on that at this time, we're probably not quite there. And I don't think anybody's suggesting that we are there, because there's a lot of forward-looking statements, but it's definitely a really big challenge that organizations are trying to solve. And in terms of the use cases I've heard so far, and obviously there will be many, it's less about trying to communicate with that one person across their multiple email addresses, but more understand who they are. And we've touched on that, like maybe looking at their lifetime value, or as Chris said, you might have an organization that works with multiple brands, right? So they might want to know who their sort of key advocates are across these brands, but that isn't always specifically only for the purpose of interacting with them on an individual basis. It's about understanding the profile of their audience and attracting more people, or taking people from one segment where they're somewhat engaged into a different segment around cross-selling and that sort of thing.
So it seems like what we're saying is that what you've just described with the new what did you call it, global customer ID?
It's the global party ID, which is generated by Customer 360 Data Manager.
That global party ID, would that be that number represented in the scenario 2 on the list here? And then the other one, which is the current model which Daniel was talking about, would be the what's referenced in part in 1, where you've got an individual object, an individual record linked to a contact record, and then you've got all these different email addresses that are linked to that individual record. So you go from the contact record to the individual record to the email address record. So that's sort of a scenario 1 there. And then you've got another scenario, which is your either your standard email functionality or an MPSP, which just replaces that regular email address. Is that sort of an overview of the couple of different approaches within Salesforce to do that? Chris,
there are several options to address that, so I think we can go very, very sideways. That's going to be subjective. I think the one conclusion here, this is from a business challenge. This is a business or organizational challenge. We as the individuals don't give a crap.
And the thing is, it's like, especially for my small business clients, like if we're getting down into these weeds, we're wasting time and money, right? So I don't know how big businesses can even justify spending a lot of time and money thinking about this. Just create duplicate contacts.
I can tell you from experience, I come across this more frequently than I'd care to. So it comes up very, very much. And it's interesting, even as simple as, if you share an email with another person, which is far more common than maybe some might realize.
Absolutely.
Yeah. As a business, how do you know which one you're talking to?
Yeah. I have a client that does events, and the events are for couples. And that is so hard because often the couples have one email address, or the couples have two different email addresses. It's really hard, even with a nonprofit success pack household model. It's really hard. So everything about this is hard, and it boggles my mind when Salesforce marketing just says it's easy. Just drag it up onto a page and it's done. It's easy.
I think
it's easy if you know what you want and need exactly. Because just think about the spouse email we're having here. From my personal perspective, this is not to be decided. So there's no amount of technology you could put in there that makes that decision 100% accurate, right? And I side with Jodie to ask, okay, if we know that that's impossible, why do we still want to solve the issue, right? So how about a generic reply? Hi, Jane and John, how do you do? Right. And I also feel we are having some very, very different perspectives. Some of us, me included, come from the database CRM type. So everything is in tables and had lookup relations and unique IDs. And some other come rather from the consumer or marketer side. And for a marketer, I believe it's always an individual or a group of persons, somebody I can touch and talk to, and they don't multiply just because they have 3 Twitter handles and 16 email addresses. And for me as a database guy, that's very hard to model at the end of the day, because I need a lot of information upfront. So like the individual object that is not really synced yet into all other platform tools there are, but without starting with the individual and collecting that individual, I'm not seeing us getting anywhere. And I'm saying this because I really would love to go back to the problem level here. So which emails are we sending now today? And is that what we leave our listeners with? It's complicated, or do we have, for the specific use case Ines presented, maybe some thoughts?
So Ines had a good idea anyway. So I'd love Ines to talk about her idea as to how she's come across this in the end with the person account type model.
Well, good idea is debatable. There is more than one way to solve the problem, and how I handled this situation in the past is very similar to that nonprofit model, where you have multiple contacts aligned into one account. So that gives you the ability in each record to have attributes that's going to help you to do that decision element of in which situation I'm now, which email address I'm using, right? So in the nonprofit success pack, for the ones that may not know, you have this concept of account as a household, and then you have the ability to have affiliations between different organizations and then relationships between different individuals. So that gives you the flexibility to link those different data tables and put attributes that help you to say, when this happens, then do this. That's how I handled before. I think one thing that Chris mentioned earlier that I think is really important to, I don't know if we're going to solve it now, but just to keep in mind, is product ethics. This is not only a business problem just because we want to increase lifetime value. We also want to serve society and look after our subscribers. So sometimes the value of the exercise is to reduce the noise. right? So if you know you've been emailing this other one for transaction emails over X amount of time, you may want to skip certain items. It's not only about increasing volume. So I thought there.
And that's a really good point between transactional emails versus marketing emails. Also, it could be a completely different story from one to the other. You know.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that's a very compelling action. But I would also, like, I consider that, at least from a personal point of view, that I would like an organization to definitely do that, but across the email that they contact with me with, rather than making choices for me as an individual as a whole. And I suppose my question is, when it comes to things like GDPR, and I'd love people's individual opinion, when I opt in or out of getting promotional material, I believe I'm doing that from an email account basis, not from an individual basis. And therefore I can opt into promotional email on one of my addresses, but not on the other. And I would therefore, just from that, my understanding of that legislation, I would be frustrated if I opted into promotional on one email address, but someone consolidated me into one person and then felt that they could send me promotional email addresses into a different inbox, which I hadn't expressly consented to.
Yeah, that's a
good
point.
People have other opinions on that in terms of their interpretation. Yeah.
But how about you have engaged with two different email addresses, yet you are using the same cookies? They have the ability to know it's still you. No,
it's not. It's for me, again, exactly what Kerry said. For me as a subscriber, it's my email address that I've given you that tells how I want to interact with you. Especially if I use aliases in my email address, to say, company X in my email address, so that I don't want to know that if they spam me, it's coming from them,
Yeah, GDPR or DPA and so on, legislations cover beyond email address. It's also the things that you do online. So if what I'm submitting is, maybe this needs its own MVP and talk, but if I'm submitting a subject access request, is for all information you have in a structured manner about me. And that will include this email address, but also other online things that I want to know you are holding in a structured manner.
So that gets back to another unique identifier. And how do we then have a unique identifier? And, in Australia, we've been grappling with this topic for 30, 40 years with the whole identity card debate. And it's never been solved. There is no, even though we have a healthcare card, a Medicare number, that's never been solved. So, and should it ever be solved? So it's such a philosophical question. But even to have our own identity number, like this global party customer ID, that's so hard at a business level. The business has got to make that decision. This is a really hard topic. I don't have an answer.
I'd say more often than not, this is generally going to be more for the benefit of the organization. I think it's just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so I think it's going to be subjective. And the one thing we haven't touched on since the very beginning, which was alluded to, this is going to be a different solution depending on which tool you're using. Not all ESPs allow you the flexibility. Some might have unique identifiers other than email. Most don't allow you a choice on what that is. Some do, most don't. More often than not, it's email or bust, or whatever their system ID is going to be. And so if somebody is listening to this and thinking, okay, well, I have X product, this doesn't help me. So I think it has to start at the planning stage. Szandor, I think you had brought this up. Have a plan, especially from a marketing perspective. 80% of your success is predicated on how well you planned, designed, and executed said plan. If you can sort of have an idea of what you want to do and why, and ask yourself why multiple times, then I think it'll be it'll be an easier thought process to get to a solution, even though it's still going to be challenging if you decide that you have to account for all of these and group them together. Because sometimes less is more, to Kerry's point, like I want one email to get all of this and that email to get all of that. You know what, might be just leave it alone sometimes, but if you must, at least have a plan for when and where and why we're doing these things. What's the value and is it really worth it? Because you're going to spend a lot of money doing it, whether you're doing it internally or bringing in multiple partners because they have different views on different areas of the business.
So yeah, with Campaign Monitor and MailChimp, we know just only work on email address. So we're at the small business end of the market here that will only deal with one email address. And so you've got to go down the route of having multiple contacts, the sort of household model with one contact to multiple, one sort of household record, or the non-profit success pack model, which is just switching out the email address each time. So, or you just don't deal with it, right? So that's at that level, and Marketing Cloud level is just so much higher than that, as far as even starting with the licensing costs and its implementation costs and the setup costs and the people to run it costs. But that you've got to pay so much more money before you can even get to this level. There might be definitely other tools in the middle that do more flexibility, but it's way different even approach to thinking about it.
Even some of the, everyone has different perceptions of who sort of where they are in the market, but even some of the common competitors to Marketing Cloud have only recently in the last couple of years started to evolve and adapt beyond email.
Yeah.
And so even some of the, most significant players are still leaning on email for most or all of their identification within that particular tool. And it may be in some cases they've started to open it up, or maybe some have opened it up to use some other ID, and is mainly from a data management perspective, because usually what happens is something gets lost in the shuffle and then ends up having duplicates of the same person. It's the same email, it's the same person. It's a duplicate problem, it's not an email problem. So even there's other challenges that sometimes knowing how to organize an individual can be solved. But I think, overarching, it's just sometimes we're overthinking it and overcomplicating it.
So this has been a good rabbit hole that we've gone down. So
did we answer any of this question?
How do we bring it back to sort of wrap it up for a solution? My solution is keep it simple and have one email address for one person.
I think there's a very individual case for each audience, for each company and organization. So, and how that audience wants to communicate specifically with its own audience, and the relationship that they want to have. So your customer makeup, and whether you interact with couples or individuals, or whether you work with something that is potentially sensitive, that you would want for that person to have very much individual control over that messaging, and how they're communicated with is also very important. I think this space, maybe not so much for small to medium businesses, but definitely for enterprises, is where they're going to be, spending some time, energy and focus, because it is the next frontier for them, where they can move that customer engagement to the next level potentially, but only if they really understand their customers well and understand all the nuances to this, including the negative impact that it could have in some situations. So I think we've highlighted that there are lots of different options, and there are lots of things to consider and lots of things to think about, and therefore that it can't just be a technology-led solution. It has to be a consumer-led sort of relationship-based discussion.
Yep. All right, anyone else got some final thoughts on this? I think we just...
Same time next week?
No.
More of the same?
We've just stopped everyone. How to stop the MVPs.
You stopped me because I love to tingle into solutions, but for solutions, I need decisions.
Yeah.
And we couldn't decide on what our organization actually looks like.
Yeah.
And we couldn't even decide on which tool in the end we will use. And those are decisions I need to get really up and running. So sorry for being a little inactive here.
Yeah, no. That's part of the process, isn't it? That we do need those decisions before we can get solutioning, but we also need to know the options to even make those decisions. So
Totally.
we've got to go to solutioning also to say, hey, well, if you do this, if you spend this money, if you do this, then you can have that solution. So you've got to at least know the solutions that could be potential before you can even make the decisions.
Yeah, we have a bunch of variables that one could be asking themselves when they encounter something similar, right? So is there any other, I was just trying to write them up here, just a quick snapshot for whoever watched this video in the back. Any other variables or things to consider
I think the other one is just the legislative impact, because you've got ethics there, but there is regulation and legislation that we've got to really think about, and that's only going to get more and more and more. And especially if every single state does what California did, that's just going to be a nightmare for the US.
This might fall under regulations and law, and sort of also cross it with the MPSP/higher ed nonprofit point of view, but householding in general. If you think about it from a familial perspective, of you've got a family unit with multiple children, and the children are under a certain age, you can't directly contact them. So you've got one sort of household member at the top, and then you have 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. And then they might have different sort of compliance or rules and regulation on what communication are you sending, when can you send it, how can you send it, and all that. I think that's something that you need to also, it comes up a lot, especially higher ed and nonprofit in particular.
Well, to offer a different perspective, maybe even a nationally different perspective, is why, please, are we adding children to our CRM?
They might be a customer.
Healthcare.
Well,
healthcare.
As I said, it's a national perspective, right? So we have very, very strict laws and regulations for what age you can track and which information you can track, which leads to rather not track until they really can buy something with their own money and their own credit card.
They might not actually try and talk to the child, but if you are a healthcare provider, NHS in the UK, you're going to know that kid exists, and you might need to, hey, someone's in immunizations are due. Your checkup is due. You're not talking to the kid, you're talking to the parent. That is a valid use case to communicate about that child, but not with that child.
And this has got us into a whole other area of conversation.
Hit the brakes. Bring us home, Ines.
Well, thanks very much for playing. I mean, all of this is food for thought, and all of those are questions that many are asking today. So I hope this is giving a train of thought, of multiple thoughts, some insights as well of how these applications work, what's the logic that runs, and a bunch of variables that as an admin or as a marketeer, you're going to need to go and find out decisions for. So thank you ever so much again. We'll do another loop with another random question anytime soon.
Thank you.